Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Do you remember this handheld right here? It's called the RGB20S. I did a review on it sometime last year. I wasn't a huge fan of it, but it ended up being super popular. Basically, a bunch of people shared some videos of it on TikTok and they just exploded, millions of views, and so this ended up being a really big seller. Well, PowKiddy is back with a different handheld. This one is called the RK2023. Now, I like the look of this one. It actually reminds me of a PSP Go, which is a device I never owned but always wanted. And so we're going to do a test and review of this device here. It actually has an upgraded chipset over the RGB20S and obviously a horizontal form factor as well. In fact, the chip in here is the same one that's on some other devices that were released last year. For example, the Anbernic RG353P. This is a Super Nintendo styled controller, obviously, but it has the same chip and screen kind of size and everything inside this one. In addition to that, another one of my favorites from last year is the Anbernic RG353M, a metal version of that one, and also a little bit smaller in form factor. In fact, these two are very similar in size, and that's kind of what I'm looking for. I want something that's somewhat small and horizontal that I can just throw in my pocket and have for some really good retro gaming. And in this video here, we're going to see whether or not this one will be a good fit, especially at a lower price point. This comes in around $70, $75 altogether. Now, I'm often pretty harsh with PowKiddy. That has to do with the fact that some of their hardware usually has issues, and then their software can be buggy as well. But you may be surprised with this one because it's actually pretty good, all things considered. Anyway, without any further delay, let's jump into the video. Okay, we'll start by talking about the price. Like I mentioned, it's about $75 right here, and it's available in both black and white. Now, PowKiddy often has sales. For example, on their website here, you can see at the top banner, they have an $8 discount code. And if you sign up for their newsletter, I think they give you a $5 code as well. Either way, expect to pay around $70, $75 for the device with free shipping. And if you'd like, you can buy a second SD card that'll come preloaded with games. It'll be another $5 for a 32 gig card, and then another $5 on top of that if you want to upgrade to 64, which is what I personally bought. So it'll come down to your budget and whether or not you're comfortable adding your own games. For me personally, I would have preferred to get the cheaper device and add my own games, but I also wanted to test out their stock card. Now, depending on where you live, it might be cheaper to order from AliExpress. The prices are exactly the same as they are on their website, but they also have a $5 off coupon here on their AliExpress store. And this will also be free shipping, but bear in mind there may be some import taxes depending on what country you live in. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the specs, but I don't want to dive too far into the details. The Cliff Notes version here is that it's going to have a 3.5-inch screen with 480p resolution, and it's running a quad-core RK3566 chip. Additionally, it has 1 GB of RAM and a 3500 mAh battery. That should give you about 6 hours of battery life altogether. But I think we should move over to the good stuff, which is actually unboxing and checking out the device itself. The box itself is relatively plain, and inside you will get a USB-C charging cable and then some quick notes about hotkeys. The first thing that drew my eye is the RK2023 logo here on the bottom. Personally, I think it would have looked a lot cleaner without it. The other thing that was surprising was that it was a little bit thicker than I was expecting. Busting out my calipers, you can see it's about 18.5 millimeters. We'll go more into detail about the thickness here in a minute. But for now, let's move over to the I/O. We have two SD card slots. The left one will be for the operating system and the right one is for your games. We also have dual down-firing stereo speakers, plus a headphone jack and 2 USB ports. The one on the left is for charging and the one on the right is going to be for peripherals. Up top we have inline shoulder buttons and then volume buttons up and down. And then next we have a mini HDMI out port. And let's just go ahead and test that right now. So as you can see right here, it actually works really well. But in order to get this to work, you will have to plug it in and then restart the console itself. But after that, it is very smooth sailing. The audio works great and the video is scaling to the proper aspect ratio even on a wider display like my monitor. And so no matter if you're playing Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, it's going to look really good. Additionally, there doesn't appear to be any sort of input lag or anything else like that. It actually feels really good. And considering that this can play a wide range of consoles, this is going to be a really nice solution. I like the idea of being able to consoleize a handheld system like this so you can play it on a bigger screen. Anyway, back to the I/O. On the right side here, we have a reset button and a power button as well. Now let's take a look at the shoulders and triggers. First impression here is that the buttons feel pretty loose. The buttons themselves are very clicky, they have a micro switch connection, and they're a little bit loud as well. The triggers, or L2 and R2 buttons, are slightly raised over the shoulder buttons, which make them easier to identify when you have your finger on them. And overall, it's not hard to press down on these buttons, but yeah, they just feel really loose. So yeah, that's quite a bit of rattle for a handheld device. I'm not a huge fan of the sound that it just makes it feel a little bit cheap. But from a function perspective, yeah, the shoulders and triggers here work. Personally, I like to have them stacked, like on the Nintendo Switch Lite, but all the same, these do work. Another thing worth mentioning is that the plastic here feels very good. It has a matte finish to it, it's a little bit powdery to the finger. And personally, I like this feeling, like it's not going to get smudged or fingerprinty over time. Now let's take a look at the buttons on the front, starting with the select and start. These are also very clicky, like these shoulders and triggers, and pretty loud, but honestly, they work just fine. Moving over to the D-pad, this one has a rubber membrane connection, so it's going to feel a lot like a classic controller. The D-pad itself has a bit of a rounded shape to it, and the travel and pivot is also very good. Additionally, the texture up top is matte like the rest of the device, which feels nice and soft. Overall, I think when it comes to just classic retro gaming, this feels like it's going to be really good. Now when it comes to playing something like a fighting game where you have to roll between like left and down, this one feels a little bit unique. From a functional perspective, it works pretty well. I can pull off the moves that I want, but the front-facing part of the D-pad itself drops off to a 90-degree angle. That makes it actually feel a little bit sharp to the fingers, especially when you're rolling between one direction to the next. And so while the diagonals seem to work pretty well with fighting games, it doesn't feel very nice on my thumb over time. In fact, after a few rounds of Street Fighter, my thumb started to ache a little bit. And so personally, I wish that there was just a little bit softer of an edge to this D-pad as it kind of drops down. Now let's talk a little bit more about those diagonals, so let's do the contra test real quick. What I'm doing here is pressing down on the D-pad as much as I can, and then rocking back and forth to see whether or not the character moves. And ideally, the character would not move very much at all, but as you can see right here, it is moving a lot. And so that will increase your chances for accidental diagonals depending on the game that you're playing. For me personally, when playing a game like Contra, I never really noticed those accidental diagonals. For me, it just kind of functions correctly. But I know there are folks out there who are sensitive to this. I see it in my comments all the time, and so if this is going to bother you, you may want to steer clear of this device. In the end, I think the D-pad is fine. You know, there are some accidental diagonals here and there, and yes, playing a lot of Street Fighter isn't going to feel great, but I'm really getting into the weeds here with something that is essentially a budget device. Overall, the D-pad is just fine. Let's move over to the analog sticks. These are Nintendo Switch style, and so if you've ever used a Joy-Con, you should probably know what you're getting into here. They are a little bit inset, but they do have a full range of motion. They feel pretty good. On the right side, we have our start button, then a small little LED hole right here, and of course another analog stick. Looking at the ABXY face buttons right here, these have a good amount of travel to them as well. They are also rubber membrane connections, so feel like a classic console. The buttons are seated just a little bit higher than I would like, and they have some wiggle to them as well. And that's not really a deal breaker, but they do feel just a little bit loose in the shell. Now, one thing I noticed when playing one of those games where you hold onto a button and then press the other, like a Mario game, I had a similar issue with sharpness with these buttons too. The angle they drop down to is a little bit severe, and so when you're pressing on one button and then trying to push the other one, you do feel that sharp edge against your finger. It's not necessarily something that really affected my gameplay, but it was definitely something I noticed on this one that I don't notice on a lot of other devices. So if I was king for a day at PowKiddy headquarters, these are the kind of changes I would like to make. All things considered, I think these are pretty good controls, especially at this $75 price point. All the buttons are easy to access, and because the device is relatively small, there's not a lot of stretch from one to the other. I would say this is probably not a device I would want to play a first-person shooter on, but honestly, you don't really have the option with the software anyway. When it comes to using the analog stick for gameplay, it actually feels pretty darn comfortable. Overall, I would say this design is definitely D-pad centric, but using the analog stick for something like arcade games still feels really nice. Now, cosmetically, there are a couple weird things going on here. For example, the bottom and top sections are shiny and slick as opposed to the matte texture on the rest of the device. And I'm not really sure what's going on here, different manufacturing processes, or maybe they changed the design as they were going forward. Either way, it's just a little bit weird to have these shiny and slick parts at the top and the bottom, but it really doesn't affect gameplay in any way. The only other thing worth commenting on is I just don't really like this logo here on the chin of the screen. I think it would have been more balanced without it. Regardless, I think this is a great size and it feels really good in the hand. Let's do some size comparisons next. We'll start with the Anbernic RG353M. As you can see right here, they are very close in size between the two. I'd say the PowKiddy device is a little bit larger just because of those rounded edges, but all the same, it's a very similar size here. The major difference here has to do with the thickness. As you can see with the naked eye, the RK2023 is quite a bit thicker. Like I mentioned earlier, it's 18.5 millimeters thick compared to the RG353M, which is about 16.5. Not only that, but the craftsmanship is much better on the Anbernic. And you can see it in just about every little thing. The shoulders and triggers are much better made. The D-pad has a nice classic look and feel to it, and they're using Hall sensor analog sticks right here as well. And like I showed earlier, the RK2023 has a rattle to it, and the RG353M right here does not. So if anything, it's almost like the RK2023 is like the poor man's version of the Anbernic. And the price difference between the two is significant. In fact, the Anbernic is about twice the price of the PowKiddy. Now granted, this one has some additional features. For example, it's made out of a nice hefty aluminum, and it also has Wi-Fi unlike the PowKiddy, and can dual boot into Android. But even then, it's kind of hard to justify a doubling of the price for those features, considering the fact that these both have the exact same chip. Speaking of which, let's take a look at other devices that use this same chip. Here is the RG353V, also from Anbernic. Now this one's a vertical device, so it's kind of hard to do a size comparison, but the major difference here are the flared shoulder buttons here on the back of the vertical device. And these back buttons make the device quite a bit thicker. We're looking at over 24 millimeters altogether. Another device with the same chipset is the Anbernic RG353P. Now in terms of screen size, as well as the D-pad and buttons, they're very similar here, but the Anbernic device is quite a bit larger just to accommodate this Super Nintendo kind of style. This one also has stacked trigger buttons, so if that's really important to you with this chipset, this might be a better deal. Another device with similar performance and stacked triggers is going to be the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. And this one's also a similar size, but also has a more blocky design to it. Now, while I have all these devices out, let's do a quick screen comparison. We'll start with the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus against the RK2023. And between these two here, I actually think the PowKiddy screen is a little bit better. I think at a normal light setting like this, the detail is much better in the PowKiddy, and also in terms of color balance, I think that this one is a little bit more natural as well. To me, the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus just has a more greenish or yellow hue to it. Now comparing another device, let's look at the RG353M. This one also has a similar level of detail to it, but I would say that the Anbernic device is just a little bit clearer. But in terms of color balance, I think I would still prefer the PowKiddy here too. For me personally, I don't like it when a screen has a greenish hue to it, and the 353M just barely has one. It's just enough for me to prefer the PowKiddy over the other. Long story short, the PowKiddy Handheld has a very nice screen for this price. The fact that it competes with an Anbernic device at twice the cost means a lot. And so I'd say the PowKiddy screen is definitely punching above its weight class. And finally, let's compare it against the RGB20S, also from PowKiddy. This one has a very similar setup to the RG353V, but it does have a nice Tiger speaker on it, which the other ones don't. It also happens to have analog sticks up top, which has always just kind of baffled me from a design perspective. Anyway, this one's going to fall into the same trap as the RG353V in the fact that the flared shoulder buttons really increase the amount of thickness. We'll test that here in a second. Otherwise, from a design perspective, there are quite a few differences here. For example, both the D-pad and the face buttons have a softer texture to them, very similar to like an Anbernic product. They're a little bit more sleek than the matte buttons and D-pad on the RK2023, but I prefer the overall feel of the buttons on the RGB20S. Now let's talk about pocketability, because this is probably the reason why we have inline shoulder buttons with the RK2023. And the nice thing here is it gives it a very uniform thickness, so it's very easy to just pop into your pocket and pull right out. And so in terms of pocketability, I would say the RK2023 is pretty good. It's a little bit thicker than a cell phone, but about that same kind of experience. And you could always throw it in your back pocket if you wanted to do that as well. By contrast, to me, the RGB20S is not very pocketable. Not only do the shoulder buttons stick out, but the analog sticks protrude quite a bit as well. In fact, when trying to pull this device out of my pocket, most of the time it actually will catch on the pocket lining. So between the two, the RK2023 is the device I would rather take around in town. I think the universal thickness right here lends a lot to that overall feel. Anyway, wrapping up the fit and feel section of this video, yeah, this one feels pretty darn good, especially at this price point. I really don't have many complaints. It's a little bit thicker than I would like, and the buttons aren't perfect, but overall, it's still pretty dang good. Let's do a quick teardown here just to give you an idea of what's inside. And as you can see, we have the battery attached here to the back, and then also our two stereo speakers as well. Looking at the board, you can see here that they're just using generic Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons, so it would be pretty easy to swap these out if something goes wrong or you wanted to put Hall sensor sticks in instead. Additionally, you can see that the CPU is front and center here on this board, and unfortunately this is directly above the battery. Now I don't think the battery is actually touching the CPU while in use, but all the same, it's not good to have a heat-producing chip like this directly over a battery. Looking further into the board, it looks like there is no rumble motor, but maybe there were plans for one right here. And same thing with the Wi-Fi chip. There's a pad here and everything, so if you wanted to solder your own on, you could. But all the same, it looks like maybe they planned to have Wi-Fi and then took it away at the last minute. And honestly, for me, that's kind of a bummer because I love having Wi-Fi on these little handhelds. Taking a look at the SD cards, you can see that the operating system card is of a generic brand. And same thing with the game card. I bought the 64GB one right here, and you can see it is unbranded. Anyway, let's turn on the device and talk about the operating system. Now, PowKiddy actually forked a popular custom firmware called Jealous. And surprisingly, they did this whole process above board. In fact, they shared their source kernel changes with the development team, and they're also sending test units to community developers as well. So I think it's pretty neat that they're using Jealous, but then also honoring the licensing terms of that operating system. In terms of user interface, it's very simple. As you can see right here, you just navigate through your different games, and then you can choose your game and load it from there. And because the device I bought came preloaded with games, if I go into any of these systems, you can see there's a bunch of offerings right here. And it looks like this is very similar to how it was in the RGB20S. However, I will say that the organization of these games is not ideal. If we go into Game Boy, we can see there are 4 different folders underneath, and under each of these folders, there's just a haphazard collection of random Game Boy games. And there's 200 plus games in each of these folders, so it's going to be really kind of confusing to try to find your game among them. What I would recommend doing is actually setting up a favorite system. So if you're scrolling through all these various Game Boy games, you find one you like the Addams Family, you can then press the X button to bring up a quick menu, and then from there, you can select Add to Favorites. And what that'll do is it'll add it to your favorites playlist, which you can then find among all the other systems. And so there it is, Addams Family right there, and it does look like they've added a bunch of other games to the favorites as well, so you'd want to remove those in case you don't want them. Anyway, that's what I recommend doing, is having a favorites playlist like this, that way any of the games you actually want to play are easy to find. Either way, it does look like the games list is pretty comprehensive here, especially when it comes to the cartridge-based systems, but because the organization is a little bit wonky, it may be kind of harder to find your game among them. Now, like I mentioned, starting up a game is super easy. You would just go into the folder and then pick the game and press the A button. It'll give you an option either to start a new game or to load a save state if you have one, and then you're off to the races. Now, to exit out of game, you would just press select and start twice, and that'll bring you right back to the main menu. Before we get into testing, let's go ahead and do an audio test. And here I would say that for the price, the sound quality is actually very good. Usually at this price point, you'll only find a mono speaker, and even then at a higher volume, it will often crackle or distort. But here we're getting some pretty clear audio. It's not as loud as I would like, but all the same, I don't really have any complaints at this price point. Next, let's talk a little bit about some of these settings that you can change within the stock operating system. For example, with Game Boy, as you can see, the game is actually playing in black and white. If you want to add some colorization to it, what you would do is exit out of the game, and then within the Game Boy menu, just press the select button and then choose Advanced System Options. Within here, you'll find a bunch of different things that you can do on a per system basis. What we're going to do is go into colorization and then pick our favorite color among here. For me personally, I like Special 1. Also, while we're in here, we can change the shader or filter as well. For these handheld systems, I like to use a specific shader called Handheld/LCD3X. Anyway, after you select that, it's going to apply to every Game Boy game. So no matter what you open up, it's going to have that nice colorization and that LCD shader. This is a nice way to be able to adjust the settings without having to go into RetroArch to do it. And the same tricks will work for any system. So for example, here with Game Boy Color, I added that same LCD shader. Anyway, moving on, when it comes to handheld systems, as you can see right here, the stock operating system has configured these all correctly. So when it comes to something like Game Gear as well as Game Boy Advance, they're scaling to the proper aspect ratio of the device. And these games all look and play really well, and when it comes to performance, this thing is way powerful enough to be able to play all these no problem. It'll be the same story with your 16-bit systems like Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. These are all going to play just fine and are scaling properly. Now on my stock operating system card, it didn't come with a lot of PlayStation games, I think maybe 5 altogether, and that's because the CD-based systems like this just have larger file sizes. Either way, when it comes to PlayStation 1, yeah, performance here is going to be great as well. And same thing with arcade games all the way up to the mid-90s and a little bit into the late 90s as well. And the arcade systems they've loaded up here, including Neo Geo, are pretty comprehensive. Chances are your favorite arcade game is going to be listed in these preloaded cards. Now, the first system that won't play 100% flawlessly is going to be Nintendo 64. But truth be told, most games on Nintendo 64 are going to play at full speed on this chipset. It's really going to come down to this top 10% games, things like Conker's Bad Fur Day and GoldenEye. Those won't play at full speed, but most of the others will. So as long as you're not going to be picky about perfect gameplay, I would say that yeah, Nintendo 64 here mostly plays pretty well. It's going to be about the same with Dreamcast, although performance is a little bit worse. I would say here maybe 3/4 of games are going to be at least playable. But it is going to introduce some frame skip in order to make this play properly. Again, probably not the best for emulation purists, but all the same, for $75, it's pretty cool to be able to play Dreamcast. Like with PlayStation 1, there's not going to be a ton of games on your card because they have large file sizes, and the collections are not going to be perfect. For example, here with Grandia 2, the actual audio language is in Japanese, and then the subtitles are in Chinese. And so unless you're fluent in at least one of those two languages, you might have a hard time playing this game. And it's a similar story with PlayStation Portable. Again, I'm using the stock card and the preloaded games right here, and there were only a few on here, and they probably cherry-picked them to be the ones that perform the best. But overall, I would say at least half of PSP games are going to play pretty well, maybe up to 3/4 if you really push it. Now, another nice thing about this device is that because it uses that RK3566 chipset, other custom firmwares already work on it. Just the other day, I did a video about ArkOS and how it's one of my favorite custom operating systems. And it just so happens that the RG353M version of ArkOS boots right into the RK2023. So you can also take advantage of the development work that's been done on the ArkOS custom firmware as well. In particular, one of my favorite things about ArkOS on this chipset is you have the ability to adjust the display. And so if you want to increase the saturation like I have here, or you want to change the hue to make it a little bit more red or green, you can do that in the settings here too. And so if you have specific preferences for the screen, you can actually make that adjustment here. The only thing I found that didn't work perfectly in ArkOS is the battery indicator. As you can see right here, it is showing a 0% battery and giving a red LED. Now the developer is aware of this, and they're going to be getting a test unit too, so we might get official support for ArkOS here in the future. Either way, one of my favorite things about these retro handhelds, especially the Linux-based ones, is the ability to have different custom firmware options. And so having both the stock operating system based on Jealous as well as ArkOS on day one is pretty awesome. Just bear in mind that the experience won't be as great as it can be in other handhelds. That lack of Wi-Fi means you won't be able to use retro achievements, and you also won't be able to do over-the-air updates unless you use a Wi-Fi dongle. Okay, with all of our testing out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the summary and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the RK2023. We're going to start with what I like, and most of all, it's the price. At $75 without an SD card, it's a really good deal. And given the fact that it's pretty easy to find codes and coupons on AliExpress and the PowKiddy website, you can probably pay a little bit less than that too. In fact, this price point is very close to the Anbernic RG35XX as well as the Miu Mini Plus. And those two devices are much less powerful. They cap out at PlayStation 1, while you can play Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and a little PSP on here too. Secondly, I really like the screen quality. I think it's well above its price point, and you can also adjust it in ArkOS, which makes it even better. For the device itself, I think that the overall size and comfort here is also above its price point too. It's definitely a handheld I would be comfortable with taking on a trip or just around town. I also like the fact that the HDMI out works really well. Not only do the systems scale to the proper aspect ratio, but it just feels pretty good to plug this into a TV and play it on a larger screen. I also like the fact that we have multiple operating system and firmware options. Not only did PowKiddy do a solid by actually honoring Jealous's terms, but they seem to be receptive to working with the community developers as well. So my hope here is that we'll have continued custom firmware support for this device in the future. Now, of course, this device is not perfect, especially when you have to cut corners to save on cost, so let's talk about what I don't like. And really, only the top two here actually bother me, the other three are mostly cosmetic. Either way, number one, I just wish that they had put Wi-Fi or Bluetooth inside of this device. I realize that would have brought the cost up by maybe another $5, but I would have willingly paid that. I think there's just a lot of other operability you can get from having a Wi-Fi connection, like over-the-air updates as well as retro achievements. I'm also not a fan of the D-pad and buttons that they used on this particular model. I think the angle here is just a little bit too sharp, so when I'm trying to roll different directions on the D-pad or trying to push multiple buttons, it just doesn't feel as good as it could. Now, some other things that are just kind of nitpicks. I don't really like that the top buttons are so loose. It does give a little bit of a rattle, which makes the device feel a little bit cheap. Additionally, I think the device would have looked more balanced without that logo on the chin of the screen. And finally, it's just a little bit thicker than I was expecting. I wouldn't call it a thick device, but all the same, I think it would feel a lot better and be a lot more sleek if it was just maybe 2 millimeters thinner. Overall, I actually have some very positive feelings about the RK2023. It exceeded my expectations at this price point. As it stands, if you're looking for a device at around $75 that can play a good amount of systems, this might be your best bet right here. And as I spent about a week testing this device, the same thought kind of bubbled up to the surface. And that is that I think the RK2023 is going to be a really great starter device. Number one, you have the option of buying it preloaded with a bunch of games already on it, so if you don't want to be bothered with any of that stuff, you just want to play your classic games, you can totally do that. But also, because it has some community support already, I think it's going to be a really great starter device if you want to dip your toes into custom firmware in the future. And so really, the RK2023 is a device that you could grow into. Yes, it can play all your Pokemon games right from the very beginning, but if you get to the point where you want to start adding your own games, or maybe you want to try out a different operating system, those options are going to be there as well. And for me, thinking back to when I first got started with emulation devices a few years ago, this would have been the perfect device to start with. Not only would it have given me an opportunity to learn about the whole community, but right out of the box, it's pretty good too. And so in the end, if you're looking for a retro handheld and have a budget of about $75 and you want to have something that's horizontal in shape, right now, as of making this video, I think the RK2023 may be your best bet. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think at this price point this is a pretty good deal, or are you going to wait for something better? And as we all know, there will be something better at this price point sometime in the future. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!